Hi, I'm Darcy Scott Martin from TrueMajority.org here with John Isaacs from Council for a Livable World in the anti-war room on StandUpCongress.org. We're missing Tom Andrews today, but we'll be having him again next week when we're continuing to discuss the issues going on in Congress about the Iraq legislation and the war in Iraq. We are in the end of the recess period for the House. The Senate is already back in session, and we're moving forward now with discussions about what's going to be happening with the bills, the supplemental bills that passed prior to the recess. In the case of the Senate, they had already named a conference committee members, and the House will be doing that when they return. Some of the news of the day that's happened just as we're doing this filming is that President Bush invited leadership from the Senate and the House to come to the White House to talk to him about what was going to be happening with the conference committee report for the supplemental. However, the reaction that immediately came from Senate and House leaders was, we would like this to be a discussion, not the president just saying what his position is, because he's made that position quite clear publicly. But in fact, it now seems that some kind of a brokered deal has occurred that they will actually have the meeting in the White House. John, what did you hear from folks in the Senate about that discussion or things that are getting going again now that the Senate is back?
The most significant thing is nothing much is happening. There's what we're dealing with is the foreplay, the jabbing back and forth between the Democrats and Republicans with Bush criticizing and Cheney criticizing Democrats saying the war is going badly. The clearest thing that's happening is nothing's happening very quickly. We're now about close to mid-April, and the bill probably will not, the supplemental appropriations bill, which has the anti-Iraq war legislation, probably won't be passed till the end of the month, end of April. So we have to get first the Senate back, then the negotiators in the House and Senate side comparing the two versions of the bill that they passed, the supplemental appropriations, and coming up with a common agreement. Then that bill has to pass the House and Senate all over again, and then it goes to the president for signing. And of course, the president, as we know, has promised to veto it. So there are a lot of statements back and forth, but one, no negotiations really between the House and Senate. Two, no negotiations between the president and the congressional leadership. So we're in a basic stalemate situation with little going on immediately.
I noticed that one of the big recess talking points it seemed that the president wanted to go with was, you're not doing this fast enough and you're actually going to hurt the troops by not getting it done. He just happened to kind of fall on his sword on that because the very same week a congressional report that had been mandated came out to say that there was enough money to make it to a reasonable point that these bills could be passed. So it was kind of an odd messaging
right.
mistake.
The Republicans are using two sort of side talking points on what's going on. First of all, they talk about, oh, you're delaying the money. We need it right away. The soldiers will be without food, without armor, without bullets. You got to do this fast. But we do have a report from the Congressional Research Service, but in fact they have money probably to mid-July at least. They're also saying, hey, this bill's been before you for 60 days, you got to get this bill passed. And in fact, there's a history of these supplemental appropriations bills to pay for the war. When Republicans were in charge, they've taken much longer to pass the bill. And then there's one other sort of side issue Republicans are trying to use to beat Democrats over the head about the so-called pork in the bill, the additional $25 billion for veterans' health care, hurricane relief, and to be fair, some pork items as well. And the Republicans are saying, see, you're messing up the bill. This should be a bill to pay for the troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we should eliminate all this other stuff. So we're sort of dealing with a lot of side issues, but the main issue is, should the war continue? Should Congress have a role in stopping the war, or should the president continue business as usual, keep expanding the number of troops there indefinitely and keep the war going forever?
And certainly it's the case that virtually no supplemental piece of legislation has ever passed without extra funding for other projects that the Republicans put on when it was their bill to handle. You alluded to kind of news of the day as well, which is Secretary of Defense Gates announcing publicly that there was going to be an extension of tours of duty in Iraq from a year-long tour to a 15-month duty, and that was also going to happen around the world in other duty stations. Obviously, at a time when things are so unpopular, that's going to have some repercussions with, families in the military, et cetera. But it seems like he's actually making an effort to do some planning, which has not been seen as things that have happened in the past.
What Secretary of Defense Gates has done is point out another one of the many downsides of this war. I mean, a lot of American soldiers have been killed and wounded. A lot of Iraqis have been killed and wounded. Been total disruption of the country. But we're also having serious negative effects on the U.S. Armed Forces. We've had people who have to go second and third tours to Iraq. Their tours are being extended now 15 months when they were told they'd be home in 12 months. The time back in between tours of duty back in the States has been cut down. So what's happened is the U.S. Armed Forces, I think even Defense Secretary Gates can see this, is pretty much stretched too thin. And if there's another crisis in the world, the U.S. Armed Forces is simply not going to be ready. So it's just one of many downsides of this war. Another reason to bring it to a conclusion as soon as possible.
Because certainly there's nothing in the supplemental that would amend that problem. You know,
No.
Fundamentally, there are only a certain amount of people who are fighting the war.
Let me just add, people are talking about expanding the size of the armed forces, but even if that takes place, it's going to be several years down the road, long after, we hope, long after the war is over.
Right, and there's a lot of controversy involved in that as well. We would just want to talk for a minute about things that have been going on during these last 2 weeks. You know, obviously it was a recess period, and people were doing a lot of great work out in their districts, talking to their members of Congress about what they feel about this issue. There are very specific targeted campaigns on the Senate side, since the numbers there are so much more manageable. In Maine, New Hampshire, and Minnesota, talking about senators who have critiqued the war at a certain level, but then gone ahead and voted, you know, with the president on the war. And those campaigns are continuing and ratcheting up, even as those senators have come back to work here in Washington, and will continue through the next few months in hopes that these further votes on the supplemental, and then more importantly, the fine gold legislation that has now just gotten the support of Harry Reid, that sets some timelines in motion, might garner their support. So that's something that people are still out there doing.
Yes, there's certainly a lot of pressure on the Republicans and some Democrats too who have supported the war. As you say, there are a number of politicians who have said, oh, we're not quite so sure about this troop increase, we're not so sure that the war is going well, but when it comes down to voting yes or no, do you continue funding the war, do you set a timetable for getting out, they refuse to vote for that legislation. They're trying to have it both ways. And so there is this pressure going on in the states you mentioned, in other states. A lot of groups are very active in raising the war, making sure the constituents know how the members are voting, which is different from the way they're talking. And even if we can't get the votes on the supplemental appropriations bill, there will be, as we've said before, further votes down the road, votes on Iraq and the defense authorization bill, perhaps May or June, votes on Iraq when the defense appropriations bill comes up, maybe June or July. There'll be a whole series of votes, and the pressure's on. Republicans lost badly in the 2006 election because they are perceived as war supporters, and they're going to lose badly again in 2008 if they continue supporting the war.
Yeah, and we're wrapping up now, but I also would mention that there were those 5 Republican House members who just went on record saying that they really think a compromise is important at the end of this supplemental fight. And so, you know, the more, and some of them were kind of newbies to the discussion of, you know, obviously Wayne Gilchrist from Maryland has been out for a while against the war, but there are other newer folks who are starting to see more fissures, more cracks, more ways that they can't continue this agreement with the president at all costs.
Right.
Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. When we're back next week, Tom will be here as well, and both the House and the Senate will be back, and I'm sure excitement will be in the air.